Hello brothers and sisters, welcome to this video. It is 7:25 p.m. UK time, Tuesday the 17th of March. So the name of this video is Exodus 2020, and I woke up this morning and I had joy in my heart that I can't explain as I woke up, and as the day has progressed I realized why I came across this information today. I put this presentation together in the last few hours, and I have really enjoyed doing it. So I hope that you enjoy it, and let's get to it. So Exodus 2020. It says in Micah 7:15, according to the days of thy coming out of the land of Egypt will I show unto him marvelous things. The nations shall see and be confounded at all their might. They shall lay their hand upon their mouth. Their ears shall be deaf, they shall lick the dust like a serpent, they shall move out of their holes like worms of the earth. They shall be afraid of the Lord our God, and shall fear because of thee. And that is obviously referring to Egypt, but with reference to according to the days of thy coming out of the land of Egypt will I show unto him marvelous things. And of course that's referring to the world, and that is what I want to cover in this presentation. The next verse is Ecclesiastes 1 verses 9. The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. So we are at a unique period of time right now where I believe that we can use the Bible to determine certain things which are going to happen right before the day of the Lord, just like God says, according to the days of thy coming out of the land of Egypt. So if we look closer into that period of time, can we see similarities in our world today, and can we glean from the story of Exodus as it is in the Torah information which is relevant to today? And of course there's only one period of time in the world that we can do this, which is right now, if that is the case. So that would be right before the rapture of the church. We would be able to utilize that information which is in the Bible in order to gather an idea of how God is going to do this. So that's kind of where I'm going in this presentation. So the plagues and the Egyptians, I'm sure you guys know there were 10 plagues in total, so we'll just go through those very quickly. I'm not going to go into much detail, but the first plague was the plague of the blood waters. The second plague was of the frogs. The third plague was of lice, and the fourth plague was of flies. And then in the account of the Exodus, after the plague of flies in Exodus 8:24, it says, and the Lord did so, and there came a grievous swarm of flies into the house of Pharaoh, and into his servants' houses, and into all the land of Egypt. The land was corrupted by reason of the swarm of flies. And Pharaoh called for Moses and for Aaron and said, go ye, sacrifice to your God in the land. So this was after the fourth plague. And this is when Pharaoh says, you can sacrifice to your God, but you can sacrifice to your God in the land. In other words, in the land of Egypt. So this is essentially Pharaoh giving the Israelites permission to sacrifice in the land. And of course, that wasn't good enough. They want to leave and go 3 days journey. And then Moses says, it is not meet to do so, for we shall sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians to the Lord our God. Lo, we shall sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians before their eyes, and will they not stone us? We will go 3 days journey into the wilderness and sacrifice to the Lord our God, and he shall command us. So the Egyptians, what Moses, and the reason why Moses is saying this is because the Egyptians worshipped the god of the ram. So the lamb is obviously a baby ram, and so the Egyptians saw that as an abomination. And we also read in Genesis 46:33, where Joseph says to his brothers, and it shall come to pass when Pharaoh shall call you and say, what is your occupation? So this is when Joseph brings his brothers back to Egypt. That ye shall say, thy servant's trade hath been about cattle from our youth, even until now, both we and also our fathers, that ye may dwell in the land of Goshen. For every shepherd is an abomination unto the Egyptians. And that's because the Israelites used to, of course, rear sheep, and they used to do sacrifice. So, but they weren't allowed to do that in the land of Egypt, and that's the whole reason for the Exodus. So remember that the reason why God brought on the plagues onto Egypt and destroyed Egypt and the Egyptians was because of the Abrahamic covenant. It was that God promised Israel the land, and then he recognized after the 400 years that it was time. He heard their cries, and Pharaoh didn't want to go. So it was about the everlasting land covenant made with Abraham that the plagues came upon Egypt, and that is the reason why God restored Israel and pulled them out of Egypt when he did. Then is the plague of livestock pestilence. So this was the pestilence that came upon the cattle, and this was after this discussion which had just happened about the sacrifice, saying that you can go and sacrifice in the land of Egypt, which obviously wasn't sufficient. Then the plague of livestock comes upon the actual cattle themselves, the Egyptians' cattle. And notice how before that it was more of a bother of the Egyptians themselves, and then it became about their cattle. But if we have a look, we'll see there seems to be a missing judgment in the book of Exodus, because the sixth plague is the plague of boils, which was the boils came on man and beast, which was an indication that God is in control of the physical health as well. And after the sixth plague, then comes Exodus 9:13. It says, and the Lord said unto Moses, rise up early in the morning and stand before Pharaoh, and say unto him, thus saith the Lord God of the Hebrews, let my people go, that they may serve me. For I will at this time send all my plagues upon thine heart, and upon thy servants, and upon thy people, that thou mayest know that there is none like me in all the earth. So notice that in verse 14, I will at this time. Okay? Then verse 15 says, for now I will stretch out my hand, that I may smite thee and thy people with pestilence. So this was after the sixth plague, which was the plague of boils. He's saying, now I may smite thee and thy people with pestilence, and thou shalt be cut off from the earth. So this is interesting, because the next plagues which came upon Egypt did not involve a pestilence. There was no pestilence after God had sent this. And he did not cut Egypt off from the earth, because of course there were various battles between the Egyptians and the Syrians, and God said to Israel when they got into the land, don't go down to Egypt, and Egypt is still here today. So this has not happened. In verse 15, for now I will stretch out my hand, that I may smite thee and thy people with pestilence, and thou shalt be cut off from the earth. So I don't think that has been fulfilled, because the next three plagues, as you'll see, were not pestilence. So I think God might be talking about now at this time in the season, as in this, at this period is when I'm going to stretch out my hand and smite your people with pestilence, that I can cut off from the earth. So I think this is a future prophecy, and this is where I'm going with this. So verse 16 then says, and in very deed for this cause have I raised thee up, that's Pharaoh, to show in thee my power, and that my name may be declared throughout all the earth. As yet exaltest thou thyself against my people, that thou wilt not let them go. Behold, tomorrow at this time I will cause it to rain a very grievous hail. So that's not pestilence. Such has not been in Egypt since the foundation thereof, even until now. Send therefore now, and gather thy cattle, and all that thou hast in the field, for upon every man and beast which shall be found in the field, and shall not be brought home, the hail shall come down upon them, and they shall die. So that's certainly not pestilence. And then comes the plague of hail, which was on man and beast. And that is obviously God in control of the elements themselves. So each miracle proves that God is in control of a different aspect of the creation. And then comes the plague of locusts. That's not pestilence. The plague of locusts, man and beast as well. Their food, obviously, it completely eradicated the food for man and beast. And then came the plague of darkness. So you can see that the way this is set up, the verse 15 in chapter 9 has not been fulfilled, because it says, "And now will I stretch out my hand that I may smite thee and thy people with a pestilence, and shall be cut off from the earth." That hasn't happened. So I think that that's talking about this season, at this period of time in the future. That's what he's going to do. And of course, that's going to happen to the world, as Egypt is a representation of the world. So there we've got the nine plagues which came upon Egypt, or the 9 judgments. And now let's take a closer look at the timing of the plagues themselves and see if we can apply that to the current days that we're in. And obviously we can extrapolate that backwards. And if this is true, then we shall find out very shortly, right? In Exodus 7:25 it says, "And 7 days were fulfilled after that the Lord had smitten the river." So it only gives the time period for the first judgment and the judgment of darkness. So it says that 7 days were fulfilled after that the Lord had smitten the river. So if we take the 8 plagues, because remember the 9th plague was the plague of darkness for 3 days, and then the 10th plague was the firstborn. If we take those 8 plagues and we times them by 7 days each, we get 56 days. And then there's the 9th plague, which was the darkness, Exodus 10:21. "And the Lord said unto Moses, Stretch out thy hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, even darkness which may be felt. And Moses stretched forth his hand toward heaven, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They saw not one another, neither rose any from his place from 3 days, but all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings." So we got another 3 days, and if we add those 3 days to the previous 56 days, plus the 9th plague of darkness, gives you 59 days. And then in Exodus 12:2 it says, God says, "This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you." So this is when God is changing the calendar to say that Nisan is the head of the year. "Speak ye unto the children of the congregation of Israel, saying, In the 10th day of this month," so it was obviously in the month of Nisan that God is saying this, "they shall take to them every man a lamb according to the house of their fathers," a lamb for a house. So God is saying in this month, so they're obviously in the month of Nisan. And I would say that it's a fair assumption that this is obviously on the 1st of Nisan that this is happening. So if we say we take the 59 days previous and we add those 10 days in Nisan, which God has now said to Israel after all the 9 plagues have happened, and the 9th plague is the darkness, then he says this month. So we add another 10 days from the beginning of Nisan to the 10th of Nisan, and then you get 69 days. So on the 69th day, you take a lamb into your home. So that would be for the 70th day after the judgments of Egypt began. And then, of course, 4 days later is the Passover. So the peace deal of the century was released on the 28th of January, and that was the 3rd of Shabbat in Israel. So it was really the next day for Israel, which is the 29th of January. And if we calculate from the 29th of January 2020, as far as the day in Israel is concerned, to the 4th of April 2020, we get 66 days. And of course, 4 days later, we get 70 days. So I think that's very interesting that if we calculate from those days backwards, we get the number of days is 70 to when the peace deal was released. And of course, that is when the pestilence began. And in earnest, it started when the peace deal of the century was released. And that is when people started to die en masse in Wuhan. So I think that's very, very interesting, the timing of the plagues, how long the plagues were going for. Before the Passover was roughly 70 days, and that's exactly as we see it happening in our world today. Then we see in Exodus 11, the Egyptians believed Moses. So just going through Exodus 11, it says, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Yet will I bring one plague more upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterwards he will let you go hence. When he shall let you go, he shall surely thrust you out hence altogether. Speak now in the ears of the people, and let every man borrow of his neighbor, and every woman of her neighbor, jewels of silver and jewels of gold." So we have to remember, of course, the terrible things that had just happened in Egypt. The suffering of the people would have been far worse than the suffering of the people in the court of Pharaoh, because the people, just like we are today, are the normal hoi polloi and the proletariat, as we are, the working class people, are going to suffer much more than the elite. So they obviously wanted favor with the Jewish people because they believed what happened, and they believed Moses, and therefore they wanted favor with the Hebrews. And when it says that you should ask every woman of their neighbor, the Hebrews were asking the Egyptian woman to lend them jewels of silver and jewels of gold. And obviously these Egyptian people were so terrified of what had just happened that they gave them, the Hebrews, these gifts and the things that belonged to them to find favor with the Hebrews. And then it says in verse 3, "And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians," because they were terrified. They were terrified of what had just happened. "Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of the people." So Moses was great in the sight of the Egyptians themselves. The Egyptians believed Moses. They were absolutely terrified of what had happened. Imagine all these things. And of course, the pride of Pharaoh's heart is, and the hardening of his heart was done by God. But Pharaoh was such a proud man with such a hardened heart but all of Egypt weren't like that. The Egyptians were not hardened. They were terrified, and they really gave Moses his due recognition and his respect that he deserved. But obviously Pharaoh and his princes didn't. So and then in verse 4, and it's important to understand this and the context of this, because the Egyptians were not with the Egyptian leadership. They were with Moses because they didn't want anything else that was terrible to happen. And that's why they said, "Send them out. Don't you know Egypt is destroyed already?" And Moses said, "Thus saith the Lord, about midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die." So this is Moses saying this to the Egyptians, not just to Pharaoh, but also to the Egyptians. "And all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sitteth upon his throne, even unto the firstborn of the maidservant that is behind the mill, and all the firstborn of the beasts. And there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt." Can you imagine? "Such as there was none like it, nor shall be like it anymore. But against any of the children of Israel not shall a dog move his tongue against man or beast, that ye may know how the Lord doth put a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. And all these thy servants," that's Moses saying to Pharaoh, "all these thy servants shall come down unto me and bow down themselves unto me, saying, Get thee out, and all the people that follow thee, and after that I will go out." And he went out from Pharaoh in a great anger. And the reason why Moses was in a great anger was because he didn't want the firstborn of Egypt to die. He didn't want this to happen. He was raised in the courts of the Egyptians. He obviously had many friends who were Egyptian. He was, he had his childhood growing up in Egypt. So that's why he went out angry from the Lord, because Moses didn't want this to happen. "And the Lord said unto Moses, Pharaoh shall not hearken unto you, that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. And Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh. And the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, that he would not let the children of Israel go out of his land." So, the drama of the firstborn. Here Moses had just told everybody in Egypt after the 9 plagues which had come upon them, and everybody in Egypt had suffered these plagues, but of course Pharaoh's heart was hardened. He told them what was going to happen next, and they all knew what was going to happen next about the firstborn. And if we read in Psalm 135 verses 8, it says, God, who smote the firstborn of Egypt, both of man and beast. And we read a similar thing in Psalm 105:36. It says, God, he smote also all the firstborn in their land, the chief of all their strength. But in Psalm 136 verses 10, it's slightly different, and it's different in the Hebrew, and this is recognized in by the Hebrew scribes. It says, to him that smote Egypt in their firstborn. You see, it's different. They smote Egypt in their firstborn, for his mercy endure forever. So Egypt was actually smote by their firstborn for a short period of time. It doesn't say who smote the firstborn in Psalm 136 verses 10. It says to him that smote Egypt in their firstborn, because it was the firstborn who smote Egypt. This happened on Shabbat HaGadol, which I'm going to go through, which one of you guys pointed out to me. Thank you for that. And Egyptian society was imploding, and the Israelites realized that this was a sign that the Exodus would be taking place as promised by God. And in the Jewish writings, it says that the firstborn Egyptians went to Pharaoh after Moses had made this announcement, and everybody knew about it. The firstborn in Egypt went to Pharaoh, of course, the ones who were old enough. I mean, this was the firstborn of absolutely everybody, whether you were the firstborn of one generation or the firstborn of the last generation was irrelevant. If you were the firstborn, you were going to die. So you can imagine everybody who knew that they were the firstborn in the family was going to die according to the words of Moses, and those were the same words which told them about the 9 plagues before, which all came true. And so the firstborn of the Egyptians went to Pharaoh and asked him to send the Israelites out, but he and his princes refused. And in Exodus 12:37, we see how many people actually left, how many were in the Hebrew camp and how many left in the Exodus. It says, and the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 on foot. Just the men, besides the children. That doesn't mention the women. So 600,000 on foot were men. So you're talking with the women probably 1.5 million people that are included in the women and the children. So the number of people that had to sacrifice the lamb in Exodus 12:4, God says, and if the household shall be too little for the lamb, this is where God says you must take the lamb into your house, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the souls. Every man according to his eating shall make your count for the lambs. So you're talking about 1 million people, and obviously the families that made up those millions were told to take a lamb into their home. And do you think that there were 1 million lambs in Egypt at that time? I don't think so. I think there might have been many, but I don't think that there were 1 million of them. And of course, when the Egyptians saw this, they asked, it's written in the Mishnah, it says, why are you doing this? And they responded, to slaughter our Passover sacrifice as God commanded us. And the Egyptians ground their teeth when they learned that their gods would be slaughtered, because Pharaoh gave permission for that to happen, and their gods were the rams. So they were very, very annoyed, and yet they were not able to say a thing to them. So imagine all the Egyptians, after everything that's just happened, after what Moses has just said, suddenly every single lamb in Egypt disappears. Every single lamb in Egypt, which the Hebrews were the shepherds, remember, and the Egyptians had their cattle was destroyed. All of the lambs in Egypt were taken into the home. That is a disappearance, my friend. They disappeared. They weren't slaughtered out in the open. God says you take the lamb into the home, and then after the 4th day, you slaughter it, and then you put with hyssop, you put the blood on the doorpost and the lintel. Every lamb in Egypt disappeared on the 10th of Nisan, 4 days before the Passover, they vanished. Okay, and of course you can imagine the reaction which the firstborn had when this happened and they saw this was about to take place. The firstborn launched a war on the Egyptians and slew many of the Egyptians, and this means that the Exodus miracle began on the 10th of Nisan because the Jews started to see the Egyptians imploding after the land disappeared into the home of the Israelites, and society itself with the firstborn that were rising up because they wanted the Egyptian leadership and Pharaoh and his princes to kick the Israelites out, but they were basically given a death sentence because Pharaoh obviously didn't believe that that was going to happen, and his son was very young. But it's interesting because obviously Pharaoh was not the firstborn, which brings into question why was he Pharaoh. But anyways, that's another topic. So Shabbat HaGadol on 4/4. This is called Shabbat HaGadol by the Jews. It is HaGadol, which is the great Shabbat. Gadol is big or great, but this is HaGadol, which is the great Shabbat, and that's of course the day that we're looking at. The Shabbat preceding Passover is called Shabbat HaGadol because of the miracle that happened on that day, which was the implosion of Egypt against itself that began 4 days before the Passover, because as they took the lamb into their home and all the lambs in the land of Egypt disappeared, then Egypt started at that moment to be destroyed by its own firstborn. And also it's called Shabbat HaGadol because of Malachi 4:5. It says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." And if they're obviously waiting for Elijah, they are expecting him around the Passover time. I've covered this in previous videos, considering a Passover rapture, and how they read the Haggadah and they leave the door open for Elijah and they pour another cup of wine. And so the Passover period is when they are expecting Elijah. And in the Hebrew, it says Yom Yud He Vav He HaGadol V'Norah. So that is the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and that is HaGadol. So this is the same as Shabbat HaGadol, the great and dreadful day of the Lord. They're expecting Elijah to come on the Passover period, and the Passover, the Sabbath before the Passover is Shabbat HaGadol, and that is 4/4, which is when Venus is at the Pleiades and all the other things that I have covered. So I hope you enjoyed that, guys. The things continue to happen in our world. Lockdown continues and all the things are happening. And we shall see how this plays out over the next few days. So the pestilence started around the same time as the peace deal of the century came, or at least that's when it really got going and started to kill people. And that was 70 days before the Passover. And if we use the dates in the Exodus, we can see that there were roughly 70 days of plagues, and there seems to be a missing prophecy in there, or a missing pestilence that God said that he was going to do, but it certainly wasn't done after those, after he said that and the following plagues. So I hope you enjoyed that. I love you, and I will see you in the sky.